Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast. I'm joined on the podcast today by Stephan Fath. Stephan joined Roland Berger in 2015, where he specialises in advising global pharmaceutical, MedTech and chemical industries, as well as private equity funds and investors. Before that, Stephan has an interdisciplinary background, holding a double degree in business administration and chemistry from the University of Dusseldorf in Germany. Stephan, welcome to the podcast today. Great to have you here.
Luke, thank you very much for inviting me. Very glad to be here today.
To begin with, Stephan, maybe you could explain a bit about Roland Berger and the types of projects that you work on, please.
Sure, happy to do so. So Roland Berger, we are a global strategy consulting firm. I personally focus my work on the pharmaceutical space, where we have a team of more than 200 people dedicated to the life science space and do strategy work across commercial operations, transformation, and performance improvement.
I'm glad we've got you on. The analysis that you do at Roland Berger is really interesting in giving an insight into what's happening within pharma manufacturing. Maybe if you could give us a bit of a background into how you've seen pharmaceutical manufacturing networks evolve over the last few years.
Sure, very happy to do so. When we look back, what happened historically is that there was a strong trend towards globalization, but also diversification. And that has really been the driving force behind how network designs have evolved. Pharma companies have increasingly tried to globalize their supply chains. They try to set up global footprints, on the one hand, to get access to local markets, but also to mitigate their risks globally and take advantage of cost efficiencies. So what we have seen is that the centralization of supply chains and selected key technologies try to optimize cost. We see API production and especially generics have been heavily concentrated in China and India, whereas FDF capacities and biologics, they have mostly been kept quite close to the end markets in the US and Europe. But what we see since COVID is that, also supported to the recent geopolitical tensions, we see there is now a strong trend to build more decentralized supply chains, more flexible supply chains, and try to make them more resilient against external shocks.
Just on that point about decentralized supply chains, what does that look like in practice? Is there a particular configuration of suppliers and FDF which are more common than others?
They would already gets quite specific in terms of technologies. For sure, when it comes to very innovative drugs, when it comes to high-priced drugs, pharma companies still aim to keep a lot of capacity internally. For sure, they look for a second source, for a third source, which very often is then taken over by CDMOs. And they either try to then build a decentralized network, or on the other hand, try to have these alternative suppliers also close to the respective end markets. So what we see is they try to flexibilize, they try to build various suppliers, various sources to make supply chains more resilient. And it's really a matter of fact of, do you want to be close to your end markets, or do you want to have a model in place which allows you to have global scale and global reach?
Talking about now in 2025, what are the kind of projects at the moment which clients are generally asking for support with? Is there a particular trend or theme which seems to come through from people?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. When I think back at the most recent projects, I think there is a pattern of three relevant topics that pop up very often. The one is there is really an increased focus on supply chain resilience. What I mean is, pharma companies try to respond to the recent disruptions and are putting much more priority on the development of resilient supply chains. That includes what I just said, building redundancies across the entire supply chain. It means diversifying their supplier base. It also means to implement advanced risk management strategies to make sure that supply continuity is ensured. And this also very heavily involves scenario modeling across the entire supply chain, from API production up to outbound logistics.
Great.
I think the second relevant topic is the relevance of how to localize manufacturing and how to nearshore manufacturing. What we see is that companies start to think much more proactively about what kind of production technologies and what kind of processing steps they want to keep close to the end markets. This is, for example, steroid technologies. This is biologic API production. And what also feeds into that are capacity shortages that we experience in selected technologies. Might it be steroid filling? Might it be mammalian production? So all of that is driving really a trend to localize production and secure capacities. What is also feeding into that is the entire topic of GLP-1s we currently see. That has really accelerated the entire fight for capacities, especially on peptide manufacturing, especially for steroid fill and finish. On the other hand, despite there is a fight for capacity, we see some regions gaining also interest in building local capacities. Talking about the Middle East, for example, that is not very well known for having a global pharmaceutical production hub. They are getting much more interested in building local capacities. Might it be leveraging their integrated chemical supply chain, or might it also be to think about a more local market access strategy towards the MENA region? And I think the last topic is obviously when we talk about supply chain, it's you can never forget about cost optimization and efficiency. So that always plays a very critical role. How can I make supply chains more flexible? How can I make them more local? That always comes with a price. So how can I design them still to make it to have reliable supply networks in place, but still having it cost efficiently is a major topic. And that also includes how can I build a strong network of CDMO partners in a world where capacity is constrained.
And for context, what are the type of companies which you are supporting on those kind of strategic decisions?
So the interesting point is it's really a topic that addresses all players across the entire value chain. For sure, it's global pharma. For them, it's obviously important how they structure their global network, but it's also mid-sized pharma, which thinks a lot about when we talk about European companies, how can they enter US? How can they have foot in the door in the Asian market? Do they need to have a local footprint? How do they set up their global CDMO network? It's also a lot with the CDMO players themselves, thinking about how their footprint and how their access to end customers might look like. And on the other hand, it's also service partners in that respect. So think about all the logistics player in that space. Think about freight forwarders. They are all heavily involved by what is happening today.
At the time of speaking, there's considerable uncertainty globally around tariffs, which have been protected in life sciences, perhaps until now, perhaps not, and the general changes in the dynamics of the global pharma business. What's your take on the types of decisions companies are having to make when it comes to reassessing their geographic footprint, particularly with regards to the United States, China, and India? How important are these types of geopolitical issues at the moment?
It's absolutely a very hot topic. I mean, there is still some uncertainty around the tariffs and the perspective how the dynamics of global pharmaceutical trade might be affected in that way. But what we do see is companies start increasingly think about what does it mean to their footprint. I think it's still a little bit early to say where we're heading to and what the impact might be. On the one hand, I believe pharma originators, they typically have healthy margins and therefore might be less affected than, for example, generic players. They operate with tight margins, or even think about CDMOs, they would be probably more affected by trade tariffs, I guess. But on the other hand, if you think about how the industry is structured, the concentration of API supply on India and China basically means that if you start putting tariffs on their supply, that could lead to a substantial supply shortage of critical medicines. But nevertheless, I truly believe that pharma companies need to act now and evaluate their footprint options in various scenarios.
Thank you. Kind of touched on it already, but what's your perspective on getting the right balance between cost efficiency and supply chain resilience? You mentioned earlier that cost efficiency is always front of mind. What's the right way to approach this, and how are companies that you work with approaching that dual sourcing strategy?
I think that is always the balance you have to take. So what do I prioritize? Is it cost efficiency or is it resilience? And that will always remain a critical challenge for pharma companies. Still, what we see today is that there is rarely the case that pharma companies rely on one supplier only. They either have certified 2 or even 3 suppliers, or they are looking for CDMOs that actually have at least some backup capacities with their own network, which means you have one supplier, but at least the supplier can provide you their goods from multiple regions. So this might in long term also favor large scale and global CDMO players, which can still provide you regional supply in a cost effective manner. So I think what is driving the resilience is still the aim to optimize cost and therefore might be in favor of scale.
In your experience, how does that decision making happen? Because it's quite hard to put a price on risk. How does that generally play out?
That's absolutely right. I think what we see pharma companies do is really taking a highly product specific and technological specific angle to that. If we talk about critical excipients, if we talk about critical process steps, if we talk about capacity which is short, they would typically try to build redundancies across their network. When we think about more commodity type excipients, might it be starch and cellulose and so on, there you can typically also rely on only a few suppliers and have just sufficient stock in your own network. So it's about making smart decisions. What are the critical parts in your own network, in your own supply chain, and try to optimize them, making it more resilient. But these are obviously also those process steps which are mostly costly.
Yes, of course. We're seeing some interesting movements around capacity and investment. The big news of last year was when Novo Nordisk acquired Catalent, for example. What's your take on the state of capacity at the moment, and how's that factoring into these strategic decisions?
I think what is happening there with GLP-1s and the acquisition of Catalent, that is really a game changer to the entire industry right now. We have seen that demand and supply for core capabilities in biologics, in peptide production, fill and finish, they've always been in quite a solid balance between demand and supply. But now the outlook for GLP-1s, this has led to a complete fight for capacities. And that is true for especially peptide production capacities, chemical production, but to some degree also microbial, and also for sterile fill and finish capacities. Now, this has caused Novo Nordisk to acquire Catalent because they tried to get access to fill and finish capacities. More precisely, it was 3 distinct sites they took into their own network. And at the same time, both Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, they continue heavily to invest in own capacities. So there is a lot of capex spending currently ongoing, not only with those 2 companies, but also in the broader CDMO space. Think about companies such as Bachem, think about companies such as Corden Pharma or Feta Pharma. They heavily invest in both peptides and sterile filling. So we expect that in this GLP-1 space, there will be also significant implications for non-GLP-1 related products. Everyone that has to deal with peptide capacities, with excipients, with fill and finish capacities in other disease areas, they will face shortages of their capacities as well. And therefore, I think right now is a perfect timing for CDMO players to think about in which areas, in which regions they want to invest and ramp up their capacities.
The antibiotics market presents an interesting case studies around these capacity challenges, particularly versus reimbursement. What are your thoughts on that? Could you explain that to us? What's going on there, please?
I mean, the antibiotics market, that's really a great example where health economics and reimbursement plays a critical role in comparison to available capacities. We've seen for years that capacity has been ramped up in India and China, and production has been offshored to these countries out of Europe. Nowadays, we see that there's largely the production in Kundl in Austria left for antibiotic supply in Europe, and that's it. So despite the recent supply shortages we have seen in Europe and we have faced, it's still rather impossible to justify any further capacity investments in Europe in that space. There's very low reimbursement rates, there is low pricing, and that is simply not enough for justifying the capex you would need in additional antibiotics production. On the other hand, we also have seen that the European Commission has recognized that, and they have launched a major program taking actions to secure the supply of antibiotics in Europe in the future. So it's going to be interesting to see what the role of policymakers will be in that space, and whether this will really have an impact on the capex strategy of pharma companies.
There's some hesitancy at the moment to make bold moves in capacity investment. What do you think is holding companies back?
I mean, for that, we need to leave the discussion on GLP-1s aside for a moment, right?
Yeah, there's no hesitancy there at all, is there?
But still, what we see beyond GLP-1s, that pharma companies are very selective in their investments. It goes down to respective technologies. In mammalian, for example, for antibodies and ADCs, we are still seeing that this is an investment driver for both pharma originators as well as CDMOs. However, capex projects to build redundancies and to secure supply for more established technologies, that is something that is still quite limited. And we also expect that this will remain limited because you will basically lose economies of scale with future investments. And next to that, I also think that digitalization and the emergence of more flexible production assets could be a leeway to break this up. Think about, for example, the BioNTainer that has been developed by BioNTech. That's a great example to provide a more modular and flexible approach to production at low cost. Still some time to prove whether this is a concept that might fly, but I think that could be a great asset and a great opportunity how to make production more efficient.
Thank you. And in talking about different modalities, it'd be interesting to get your take on what's happening with the cell and gene manufacturing market. At the time of recording, it was, I think, yesterday that Rentschler Biopharma announced its intention to withdraw entirely from the cell and gene sector. What's your feeling around cell and gene manufacturing, and particularly, I think, the balance between in-house development versus outsourced capacity?
I mean, that is quite recently a very dynamic and interesting market to watch. We have seen that the first movers in that space, they heavily relied on in-house capacity, especially for cell therapies, because you needed to build the skill, the capabilities, and it was a core capability to own the technology. Now, with the commercial success of the first products, we have also seen CDMO players invest in their own capabilities and capacities. Today, we assume that 40 till 50% of all cell therapy production is outsourced, and there is also a tendency to increase further the outsourcing share. Initially, pharma companies, they consider the manufacturing really to be a key asset, but nowadays they start to focus much more on R&D because they can rely on capable external supply partners. In gene therapy, I think it's a slightly different story. There, the outsourcing share is around about 70-80%, especially if you think about viral vectors, because it was just a super hot topic and everyone invested in own capacities in that space. But at the same time, we have seen that due to the increased interest rates, there was a funding issue that heavily affected the biotech space over the past 2 or 3 years. Now, this has led to a significant delay, prolongation of clinical trials, and therefore, at the same time where people were investing in capacity, the demand was going down. And now we see that there is just a significant overcapacity in that market. There's price pressure in that market, and that is leading to decisions such as you mentioned with Rentschler going out of the CGT space nowadays. Now, looking forward, I do think we have seen the bottom. I do expect that the market will go up over the next 1 or 2 years, especially also as numerous players, not only Rentschler, but also in the US, multiple players have shut down their manufacturing footprint. So I think, again, we are getting to a state where supply and demand will be much more balanced and the market can pick up again.
So just going through a phase of rebalancing supply and demand.
Yeah, that's my take on it. I mean, we have seen a phase over the past 2 or 3 years where demand was very little We also have been in a phase where there were not so many commercial programs available, but we do see that market access and approval of new gene therapies is hitting in, and that also the technology of BioVector gets much more mature. Therefore, I stick to my point that the outlook remains quite positive.
It'd be great to get your perspective on AI in manufacturing. How much of a focus is that for your consulting practice?
AI is a huge topic. I mean, there is barely a project which does not address any kind of digitalization and AI topics anymore. And especially in manufacturing, AI is always highly important. The use cases we see in pharma manufacturing, they are, however, quite similar to other industries. For sure, you also need to think about the regulatory environment and GMP requirements. But in the end, it's about how can I improve processes? How can I monitor quality control? It's about predictive maintenance. It's about how can I establish a good supply chain forecast and production planning. So it's quite similar to other industries, but you always need to keep in mind the specifics that the pharma industry has.
Where would a manufacturer get started with that if they haven't already? So if they're still using paper-based batch records, for example, and to try to get started on this journey, because there's certainly a perception that it can be very expensive to stop production, move in new technologies and upgrade in that way. What would be the first steps if you were advising a manufacturer to get started on this journey?
I think there were a couple of topics to be thought about. Obviously, the ultimate goal in the first step cannot be that you digitalize your entire supply chain end to end. I mean, that's a wishful thinking, and that's a great North Star you can have, but you need to make small steps in the beginning. So start with a long list of use cases across your core process. Start with a brainstorming session where you really feel there is a need to embed AI and prioritize them in terms of what impact do you expect, but also how are your current capabilities and deliver on those use cases. And once you go that way with establishing and the first use cases, bring them to life, you learn a lot. And this will help you a lot in not making here significant investments at the first step, but rather be smart on small steps that will have a significant impact in your AI journey.
Are you seeing different use cases when it comes to modalities such as small molecule, large molecule, fill finish? Is there like a different application of AI in those different areas?
For AI, I think I would not differentiate too much by modality, but rather by the value chain steps. So think about Wash, for example. They had a great example on how they successfully employed advanced analytics, AI, and demand forecasting. And that had a huge impact in the forecast accuracy. On the other hand, GSK was quite successful in implementing AI-driven predictive maintenance systems to really monitor their entire manufacturing equipment in steroids. So that resulted in a substantial reduction of their unplanned downtime in their maintenance cost. So I think here it's much more about where on the value chain do I see a strong use case for AI and invest in that specific use case. For sure, how to bring them alive, that will be highly specific to your process, to your technology. But overall, I don't see significant differences by modality type.
Taking a step back, how do you see the CDMO landscape evolving over the coming years? I mean, there are so many players, and not a day goes past where there's not an announcement of new investment and new capacity being brought online. Do you see that continue to mushroom, or are you seeing signs of consolidation or maybe a shift towards more specialization? How would you see the coming years play out?
That's a very good question. I mean, for quite some time, we have seen that consolidation was happening in the CDMO space. And this consolidation was caused both by strategic players, but also by private equity. I mean, especially private equity was a key driver for consolidating the CDMO space. Now, most recently, we see the large players such as Lonza, Catalent, Patheon. They all build a one-stop shop portfolio across different technologies and different services. But at the same time, there was also a strong trend that highly specialized players were emerging. Just think about the biotech space, think about cell and gene. There were numerous CDMO players which are heavily focused on these kind of technologies. Now, I think the most recent shift and the game changer to that is the acquisition of Catalent by Novo Nordisk. So that might really trigger a lot of dynamics in that space. We have also seen Lonza just announcing that they want to spin off their capsules business. So the entire CDMO space really remains highly dynamic. But there's also other movements. If you think about Samsung Biologics, which is a great company in biologic CDMO services, they also started to invest in their own biosimilar business and ramping up commercial activities on their own. So there is a tendency still to consolidate the market, but I also see there is a strong tendency to build highly specialized players. And there is still a tendency to think about, can CDMOs tap out of their current business and go more into own commercialization?
What does that mean then for the pharma companies themselves in this evolving market? How should their network strategy develop between now and the end of the decade, say?
When you think about that, CDMOs start to investigate own commercialization opportunities. Obviously, highly critical topic will be, how can you secure your IP? How can you secure your technological and process know-how? I mean, this is something that definitely needs to be on the priority list when you screen your CDMO network. The pharma industry has always been an industry which is a lot driven by R&D. This is the future of success. But I still believe that owning relevant and critical manufacturing capabilities is key to secure future supply. At the same time, I think there is still a strong role CDMOs play in that space, not only to build alternative supply sources, not only to ensure a resilient supply chain, but also to provide critical capabilities in innovative technologies. So I think that's a stage where we also see future developments. But on the other hand, we talked a lot about the concentration on Indian and Chinese suppliers. We talked about the flexibilization and more modular production. And I think that this also will be a key driver for the future network design. We will see more personalized medicines. Personalized medicines will mean we have smaller batch sizes, and also that again means we need to have processes, production processes, but also equipment that can be adapted more flexibly. You need to have reduced changeover times. You need to have equipment which can be used across different production types or modality, not modalities, but across different products. And all of that basically is supporting a decentralization of manufacturing. And all of that is also in favor of CDMOs, which really have a very critical role to play here, because they can support their pharma customers with the right footprint and with the right technology.
And so finally, Stephan, what advice would you give to companies who are currently reviewing their network strategy? What are your top tips to consider when reviewing your network strategy, trying to optimize and improve it for the year ahead?
I think there were three major ones, I would say. The first one, and that's probably the most relevant one, think in scenarios. No one knows the future, and you need to somehow prepare for any kind of internal and external dynamics that will have an impact on your future supply organization. Will there be trade tariffs? How will funding in the biotech sector emerge? Will cell and gene therapy see a breakthrough for diseases with broader patient populations? No one knows at this point of time. And at the same time, COOs also need to prepare for their internal pipeline, which assets will be successful, which won't. There's the role of M&A, which you cannot really plan for. This is also impacting your network. So there are so many questions and variables that you need to think in scenarios, and you need to have flexibility how and when to adapt your network. The second one is build strategic partnerships. We see that the technological breadth in the pharma industry is heavily expanding, and companies cannot manage all of them. Therefore, you need to have strategic suppliers. You need to have strategic CDMO partnerships which can help you to achieve best-in-class technologies and secure sufficient capacities. And lastly, I think operations and manufacturing, they need to be more involved in R&D. R&D has an undeniable impact on the future manufacturing setup, because in early clinical stages, you typically decide what kind of production processes you will use. And therefore, any kind of implications need to be very thoroughly thought through in the very beginning, including everything about CMC, upscaling challenges, but also whether there are going to be capacities available in the market.
Stephan, thank you so much for your time today. Fascinating speaking to you. Really appreciate it.
Look, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Experience the future of contract manufacturing at CDMO Live 2025. Join us at the World Trade Centre Rotterdam on May the 7th and 8th, 2025 for an exclusive event that brings together the sharpest minds in biopharma outsourcing. For 2 days filled with market insights, best practices and partnering. So head to cdmolive.com to download the agenda and to book your ticket.